We do have the latest CNBC All-America Economic Survey. It shows that the war and higher gas prices are weighing on President Trump's approval ratings. Our senior economics reporter, Steve Leisman, is here. He joins us with the details this morning. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Becky. Yeah, President Trump's overall and economic approval ratings plunging in the latest CNBC All-America Economic Survey. And what appears to be direct fallout from widespread dissatisfaction with the war with Iran, high gas prices, and negative views of the economy. Overall, the president has a 40% approval rating. That's down 5 points from the prior quarter, 58% disapproving, and that's up 6 points for a minus 18 net. That's the most underwater President Trump has been for either of his two terms. On his handling of economy, similarly bad numbers, 39% approving, 60% disapproving. That's a negative 21 net approval rating.
Hello and welcome, guys. Adam is here. So what just happened, guys? Trump has just broken a polling record, and not the kind anyone wants. The numbers aren't just bad, they're historically catastrophic. We're no longer comparing him to unpopular presidents who survived their terms. We're in the territory of presidents who were politically destroyed by their own public standing. The man who built his entire identity on winning is now losing in a way that has no modern precedent, and every Republican facing voters in the near future knows exactly what that means for them. The number that should be seared into every political operative's brain right now is minus 45. That is Donald Trump's net approval rating among independent voters. Minus 45.
If there's one big number from this, is that Donald Trump now has the worst net approval rating among independents of any president ever at this point in term two. He is worse than Richard Nixon, who would be going adios amigos in a few months back in 1974 in term two. Look at this, minus 45 points, worse than George W. Bush at this point in term two. The Iraq War was weighing him down at minus 37, and worse than Richard Nixon when, of course, there were all those impeachment hearings back in 1974 at minus 36 points. He's nearly 10 points worse among independents on his net approval rating at this point in term two, Donald Trump is, than Richard Nixon. My goodness gracious.
Let that figure sit in your chest for a moment and really breathe it in. Richard Nixon, the man who was literally being consumed by a criminal conspiracy, the man who had secret White House recordings that proved his obstruction, the man who stared down impeachment and removal and ultimately chose resignation in disgrace as his only escape hatch, was hovering at minus 36 when his presidency entered its terminal collapse. Trump has blown past that marker as if it were a speed limit sign on an empty desert highway.
Let's talk more about that new AP NORC poll that finds President Trump's approval rating at an all-time low. As we told you a minute ago, it shows 33% of Americans approve of Trump's job performance, down from 38% last month. When broken down by party, 31% of Republicans, as John just mentioned, now disapprove of President Trump's job performance. That's a big number considering where he's been historically. And as the Iran war drives up fuel and energy prices, the poll shows Trump losing support when it comes to his handling of the economy specifically. That approval on the issue has fallen to 30%, down 8 points from last month.
George W. Bush wrestled with the entire moral and strategic catastrophe of the Iraq War, with its mounting casualties and its shredded credibility, and his independent approval only sank to minus 37. Trump looked at both of those historically dire benchmarks and apparently decided they were insufficiently catastrophic for his purposes. The framing from the analysts covering this data tells the story. They watch the numbers come in with expressions of genuine disbelief, the kind of reaction normally reserved for natural disasters captured on live television.
I think when people responding to the poll say they disapprove of the war in Iran, they do perhaps approve of the military action. But I think what they're really saying is we also don't like gas at $4 a gallon as a result of the war we don't understand.
Yeah, that's correct. And it's not just, filling your gas up it's not just filling your car up at the pump. Willie, airline tickets have skyrocketed, right? The cost of fertilizer is up. The cost to ship goods is up. And so what has this done to the number one problem voters wanted the government to deal with? Inflation, the high cost of living. It's exacerbated all of it. So to the extent the administration could make a case that military action in Iran has made us safer and has reduced the threat, and here are the benefits right now, voters aren't seeing a benefit.
This is not a slow, gradual erosion that provides time for recalibration and recovery. This is a man who seized the goodwill generated by an electoral victory and incinerated it with breathtaking speed. Independent voters, the segment of the electorate that is theoretically open to persuasion, the people who do not reflexively align with either partisan tribe, have reached a verdict, and it is devastating. -45 is not soft disapproval that can be massaged back into neutrality with a well-timed ad campaign. This is the territory of active, energized rejection. This is the voter who has not merely soured on a candidate, but who is now motivated to make sure everyone in their social circle knows exactly how sour they have become. This is the kind of number that drives turnout for the opposition and depresses it on your own side, creating a compounding electoral nightmare that worsens every time another news cycle reinforces the original judgment. And then there is J.D. Vance, whose political trajectory has become a cautionary tale about the perils of proximity to a cratering brand. 6 months ago, Vance was sitting comfortably at 53% as the projected Republican nominee for 2028. That is a majority. That is a consensus frontrunner position. That is someone with genuine momentum and a clear lane to the nomination. Fast forward to the present, and he is now at 37%. Tied for his all-time low, and analysts tracking his numbers are using the phrase, "no sign of a bottom."
From the Vice President of the United States, chance that J.D. Vance is a 2028 Republican nominee. 6 months ago, he was at a 53% chance. Down he goes. He goes down a 37% chance, according to the Kalshi prediction market. This is tied for his all-time low, J.D. Vance. But, you just go back here. A slow or steady drop.
That is the kind of clinical, dispassionate assessment that makes political consultants quietly activate their backup career plans. Here is what makes this dynamic so revealing. J.D. Vance did not commit some massive, unforced error in the last 6 months. He did not get caught in a scandal of his own making. He did not break from the administration or publicly challenge the president. He simply remained in close orbit around Donald Trump. That is the entire story. That proximity, that association, has become sufficiently radioactive in the eyes of independent voters that Vance is getting burned simply by standing near the heat source. And here is the cruel structural irony of the situation. Donald Trump is constitutionally barred from seeking another term. He does not have to face voters ever again. He gets to be the most unpopular second-term president among independents in the recorded history of polling and then eventually walk away, delivering fiery speeches about how it was all rigged against him. Meanwhile, everyone who attached their political fortunes to his is left standing in the wreckage, trying to explain to voters why they should be trusted with power when the man they stood beside was rejected so comprehensively. Vance is burning. The broader Republican brand is burning. The special elections have been flipping districts from red to blue in a steady, ominous rhythm. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian strongman who served as an ideological template for the nationalist movement that Trump leads, just lost his grip on power, partly because the global electorate is recoiling from the association. The wreckage is spreading outward from the epicenter, and the epicenter is the Oval Office. The question that naturally follows from these numbers is simple. What do you do when your approval rating has crashed through Nixon's floor? What is the strategic response when the data tells you that the persuadable center of the electorate has abandoned you in numbers that are historically terminal? The answer, apparently, is that you release a budget. But not just any budget, a very specific kind of budget that communicates exactly which Americans matter to this administration and which ones do not. The President of the United States stood before the country and informed the working public that the federal government simply cannot afford daycare. It cannot afford Medicaid. It cannot afford Medicare. But war? War they can fund. That is not a paraphrase. That is the explicit priority encoded in the spending document this White House chose to produce. 2 days after sending that message, they released a budget requesting $1.5 trillion for the Pentagon in a single fiscal year. $1.5 trillion for the machinery of conflict and projection. And how do you balance a request of that magnitude? You eliminate the program that assists low-income families with their heating and electricity bills. You cancel affordable housing initiatives. You cut funding for cancer research. Cancer research. The administration that wraps itself constantly in the rhetoric of loving American workers, of putting the forgotten men and women first, just decided that Americans who are fighting for their lives against a terminal illness can figure it out on their own. But the Pentagon, the institution that is already the most lavishly funded military apparatus on the face of the planet, gets $1.5 trillion. The senator who took to the floor to respond to this budget was not performing theatrical outrage for a social media clip. He was reading a list of actual human beings who are being crushed under the weight of these deliberate policy choices. The nurse working a double shift in Savannah whose utility assistance is about to be yanked away. The farmer in Tift County who is absorbing the simultaneous blows of a trade war, diesel price spikes, and fertilizer cost inflation, all hitting at once with no relief in sight. The family in College Park that has stopped scheduling doctor visits because the insurance premiums became unmanageable after this administration gutted the ACA subsidies that kept them afloat. These are not rhetorical abstractions. These are specific people in specific places facing specific, quantifiable hardship because of choices made by the people who are supposed to be serving them. And the verdict the senator delivered on the floor was not ideological. It was descriptive. The rich get tax cuts. The well-connected get stock tips. Everyone else makes sacrifices. That is the record. That is the budget. That is the priority list, and the priority list is not hiding. It is published in black and white for anyone who cares to read it. Now, as this backdrop of who benefits and who suffers under the current regime intensifies, a parallel story is exploding inside the halls of Congress that threatens to accelerate the unraveling even further. Momentum is surging for the expulsion of multiple scandal-plagued House lawmakers, and the dynamics of this fight are a perfect trap that Republicans walked directly into. Members from both parties have expressed serious interest in removing Representatives Eric Swalwell and Tony Gonzalez from the House, with Representatives Corey Mills and Sheila Cherfilis McCormick potentially next in line. This is not a minor disciplinary squabble. This is a rolling series of bombshell accusations involving sexual assault and misconduct that have implicated members on both sides of the aisle. Representative Anna Paulina Luna announced over the weekend that she intends to force a vote on expelling Swalwell, a Democrat who is also campaigning for governor of California. Democrats immediately countered by signaling they would force a parallel vote on the expulsion of Tony Gonzalez, the Texas Republican who has been accused of sexual misconduct and whose office has been the scene of documented, severe harm to staff members. Luna, recognizing the political untenability of a one-sided crusade, quickly signed on to the idea of removing both colleagues, publicly stating that she would inquire with the House parliamentarian about pairing her motion against Swalwell with one against Gonzalez. Both need to go. That was her formulation. Both. A growing and bipartisan coalition of lawmakers has co-signed the idea of a paired expulsion, including Representatives Byron Donalds, Pramila Jayapal, Jared Huffman, Mike Lawler, and Nancy Mace. Mace issued a statement of remarkable clarity for a political environment that usually prefers ambiguity. Congress must hold itself to the highest ethical standard regardless of party. Based on the facts and information that has come out, Swalwell, Gonzalez, and Cherfilis McCormick should all resign from Congress effective immediately. If not, Congress should move to expel all three of them upon our return. Leadership and members in both parties should have moral clarity and recognize that some things are more important than vote margins and party loyalty. That last sentence is the one that should send a shiver down the spine of every Republican strategist who has been running the numbers on the midterms. Some things are more important than vote margins. When a member of your own caucus is saying that publicly, the internal discipline that holds a majority together is beginning to crack. Mace went further, listing the disqualified members by name and demanding their resignation. Another member, Gabby Birnenbaum, added her voice to the chorus. The number of lawmakers interested in the paired expulsion, one Democrat and one Republican, is expanding. And here is the detail that transforms this from a Washington ethics story into an electoral earthquake. Texas's 23rd district, the seat currently occupied by Tony Gonzalez, would immediately become competitive if a special election were triggered. The district is rated Republican +7, with a Trump margin of +15 and a Cruz margin of +8. It is majority Hispanic, and Democrats have been methodically eyeing this seat for November, sensing that the demographic shifts and the broader political environment are converging in their favor. Now, let's absorb all of this as a single unified narrative, because what we are witnessing across the polling data, the budget fight, and the expulsion drama is not three disconnected stories. It is one integrated story of a political machine that is breaking down in real time and dragging everyone inside it toward an electoral reckoning. Start with the numbers, because they are the foundation upon which everything else is built. -45 among independents. I keep returning to this figure because the political media is not, as a general matter, treating it with the historical gravity it commands. Richard Nixon, the president whose name became synonymous with constitutional crisis and disgrace, the man who was caught on tape orchestrating a cover-up from the Oval Office, was not this far underwater with the pivotal swing block of the electorate at the same stage of his doomed second term. Nixon was at -36, Trump is at -45. That is a 9-point gap between the current president and the most famously disgraced president of the modern era, and the gap is not in Trump's favor. When Nixon's numbers collapsed, there was a specific precipitating cause. There were the tapes. There were the televised hearings. There was a clear and singular event that the public was processing and reacting against. With Trump, what is the specific thing that has driven independents away? Is it the tariff regime that has spiked prices on household goods? Is it the budget that explicitly prioritizes military spending over cancer research? Is it the constant churn of senior officials being pushed out or resigning under pressure? Is it the broader atmosphere of chaos and recrimination that has defined the second term? The answer is that it is all of it, simultaneously. There is no single smoking gun. The entire edifice is on fire, and the president is standing in the center of the conflagration, insisting that it is a controlled demolition. The personnel churn compounds the perception of instability. Kristi Noem was pushed out as Homeland Security Secretary. Markwayne Mullin is being rotated in. These are not the orderly transitions of a well-managed administration. This is a revolving door, and every time it spins, the narrative degrades a little further. The optics darken. The voters who were already leaning toward skepticism find their doubts confirmed. Independent voters are not consuming a steady diet of partisan cable news and interpreting events through a pre-processed ideological lens. They are observing prices at the grocery store checkout. They are reading their utility bills. They are opening their health insurance renewal notices. And what these real-world data points are telling them is that their material conditions are deteriorating, while the people ostensibly in charge are consumed by internal warfare and blame shifting. The senator who spoke on the floor understood this connection viscerally, which is why his remarks landed with such force. He was not discoursing on abstract policy trade-offs. He was naming specific, identifiable human beings. The nurse in Savannah pulling a double shift whose energy assistance is about to be terminated. The farmer in Tift County absorbing tariff-driven cost increases from every direction. The family in College Park that has stopped accessing medical care because the premiums became unaffordable. These are the people who populate that -45 number. These are the voters who either pulled the lever for change, stayed home in frustration, or are actively reconsidering their prior political commitments. And what is the official response they are receiving from the administration that claims to champion their interests? We can only afford to fund war. That is the message. You cannot afford your child's daycare. You cannot afford your mother's Medicaid. You cannot afford your own Medicare coverage. But $1.5 trillion for the Pentagon is not merely affordable. It is a priority that justifies sacrificing everything else. This budget is not a spreadsheet. It is a confession. It tells you exactly who this administration values and who it views as expendable. The administration invested enormous political capital during the campaign cycle, promising to be the voice of the working class, the defender of the forgotten Americans, the enemy of the elites who had rigged the system. That was the sales pitch. And the budget now on the table ends the program that keeps poor families from freezing in winter or sweltering in summer. It eliminates affordable housing. It slashes the funding that keeps cancer researchers in their laboratories searching for treatments that will save lives. Cancer research. I am repeating that phrase because it should be impossible to say without feeling a moral shudder. They found a pathway to allocate $1.5 trillion to the military and could not find a way to sustain the scientific enterprise that keeps human beings alive. That is not an inadvertent omission. That is a value judgment. The priority list is published, and the priority list is unambiguous. The expulsion situation is the political trap that Republicans walked into with their eyes open because they believed they could manage the fallout. Tony Gonzalez should have been dealt with long ago. The behavior was not a matter of disputed allegation. The consequences were real and catastrophic. One staff member left her job because of the harassment environment. Another took her own life. And the strategic calculation from Trump and Speaker Mike Johnson was to wait it out, to let the news cycle move on, to protect the seat at all costs because the majority margin was too thin to risk a special election. That strategy is defensible only if you assume that the public is not paying attention and that the majority is stable. Neither assumption holds anymore. The public is paying excruciating attention because their economic lives are becoming harder, and the majority is anything but stable. Republicans have been absorbing losses in special elections across the map. Seats that were presumed safe are flipping from red to blue with margins that defy the historical models. Texas 23, rated Republican +7, is not a fortress in this environment. A +7 district is comfortable when the national mood is neutral. But we are currently observing swings of 20, 25, and sometimes 30 points in special elections. In that context, +7 is not a buffer, it is an invitation. So Trump attempted to run out the clock, calculating that the demands for accountability would eventually fade, that Gonzalez would survive the storm, that the seat would remain in Republican hands, and that no one would ever have to answer for what happened inside that office. But now the dynamic has shifted, and it has shifted decisively. Democrats and Republicans are jointly calling for expulsion on a paired basis, and the math Trump was banking on has evaporated. If the expulsion goes through, Texas 23 immediately opens for a special election. Democrats have been methodically organizing and investing in that seat, recognizing the demographic trajectory and the softening of Republican support among Latino voters that the tariff-driven economic pain has accelerated. A swing of even 20 points in that district makes it genuinely competitive. A swing of 25 or 30 points, the kind of swing we have been observing in other special elections, and you are looking at a seat that Trump carried by 15 points flipping to the Democratic column. That is not a fever dream. That is a plausible scenario in the current environment. And if that seat flips, the majority shrinks. Mike Johnson is already navigating the narrowest of operational margins. He cannot afford a single additional loss. And if the pressure builds sufficiently, if enough seats shift, the conditions emerge where individual members like Thomas Massie acquire disproportionate leverage, where the legislative agenda stalls entirely, where the second term reduces to a series of increasingly desperate executive actions and veto threats because the conventional legislative path is no longer viable. That is the scenario that should be disrupting the sleep of every Republican strategist. The operative question is no longer whether Tony Gonzalez survives the ethics scrutiny. It is what the electoral map looks like when the midterms arrive and the party has to defend a budget that cuts poor people's energy assistance to fund a $1.5 trillion Pentagon. Picture what it looks like to campaign for a swing district Republican in this landscape. You are standing on a doorstep in a district like Texas 23, and you have to explain to a family why the heating assistance that kept their grandmother alive through the winter has been zeroed out so that the Department of Defense, which already commands resources beyond any military in history, can get even more. You have to explain why cancer research is being sacrificed. You have to explain that this is not a mistake or an unintended consequence, but a deliberate expression of the administration's values. That is not a conversation any Republican candidate wants to have, but that is the conversation the president has just mandated, and it will be the defining conversation of the midterm cycle. The Democratic message writes itself, and the senator on the floor delivered it with more precision than anything the party apparatus has produced in a very long time. The well-connected get stock tips. The rich get tax cuts. Everyone else gets asked to sacrifice. That is the closing argument. That is the script for every door knock and every television ad between now and the election. Its power derives from the fact that it is not an ideological abstraction. It is not a left versus right framing that only activates the base. It is a straightforward description of observable reality, and it invites voters to verify it against their own lived experience. The nurse, the farmer, the family avoiding the doctor, these are not talking points. They are constituencies. They are actual people in actual communities, and they are being systematically harmed by a set of choices that are on the public record. Trump cannot defend this budget on the policy merits because on the merits it is indefensible. Cutting heating assistance for vulnerable families to expand a military budget that is already the largest on earth is not a position that wins a substantive debate. So the alternative is what it has always been. Attack the press, attack the judiciary, attack the Democrats. Identify a scapegoat, inflate the volume until the audience is too exhausted to remember the original question, and hope that the noise generates enough confusion to blunt the electoral consequences. But that strategy has a ceiling, and the -45 among independents is what the ceiling looks like when you have slammed into it at full speed. Independent voters are no longer susceptible to the exhaustion game. They are not following the daily press conference drama to determine who landed a rhetorical blow. They are monitoring their own bank accounts, their own health insurance portals, their own utility statements. And those statements do not lie. They do not spin. They simply present the cost, month after month, and the cost is rising. J.D. Vance understands this dynamic at a level that his public positioning cannot admit. His numbers are not declining because of any specific failure in his own performance. They are declining because the brand he is yoked to has become toxic to the voters who decide competitive elections. Dropping from 53% to 37% in the 2028 nomination prospects, with the analysis flatly stating that there is no bottom in sight, is not a temporary correction awaiting a rebound. It is a slide. And slides do not reverse themselves through inertia. They reverse when the underlying conditions change. Right now, nothing is changing. The tariffs persist. The budget stands. The Pentagon receives its $1.5 trillion. The nurses' utility assistance remains canceled. The farmers' input costs remain inflated. The family's health insurance premiums remain unaffordable. Until any of that shifts, the numbers will continue their downward trajectory. So where is the end point? I do not possess a crystal ball, and anyone who claims to have certainty about the resolution of this crisis is attempting to sell you something. What I can tell you with confidence is that the historical analogies are not decorative flourishes. When a sitting president is polling worse among independents than Richard Nixon at the equivalent stage of his presidency, the situation is genuinely without modern precedent. Nixon had a party apparatus that eventually, reluctantly, gathered the courage to inform him that the math no longer supported his continuation in office. Trump does not face that constraint because the current Republican Party is structurally incapable of delivering that message. The base is too powerful, the primary threats are too immediate, the institutional capacity for a candid internal conversation has atrophied, and so the party leadership simply watches the numbers deteriorate and hopes, against all available evidence, that something external will intervene to alter the trajectory. Meanwhile, the expulsion battles play out. The special elections get scheduled and the results roll in, one red district after another sliding toward the Democrats. The budget priorities remain on display, a published indictment of the administration's moral calculus. And the nurses, farmers, and families who form the backbone of the electorate continue to perform their own calculations at their kitchen tables. They know exactly what it costs to fill a fuel tank. They know exactly how much their insurance premiums have increased. They know precisely when the assistance program that kept their home warm through winter vanished. They know. And that accumulated, bone-deep knowing is what gets distilled into a number like -45. The midterms are approaching, and the arithmetic is not on Trump's side.